Well boys, welcome to a very special video. This video is going to be a lot different from my other videos, and I'm basically going to be sharing my entire life story. As you can see, the video is really long, but there's a lot to unpack here. I started this channel with the goal of helping other people get through difficult times by sharing my own personal experience and sharing how I was able to get through them. I've been trying to figure out the best way to do this video for a long time. That's kind of why it's kind of late, but I've been trying to figure out, and I think the best way is to do this just one big video. Now, I don't plan on holding much back in this video, and it's going to be a bit heavier and more raw and real than some of my other videos, but you know what, life is difficult, so I think we need to just talk about it. I grew up in California, and my childhood basically consisted of one thing and one thing only: dirt bikes. My dad got me a PW50 when I was about 3 years old. He got me into speedway racing around 4, and I was hooked from that day on. My dad and I both lived, breathed, and ate dirt. Well, I don't think we ate dirt bikes, but you know what I mean. So much so to the point he built a flat track in our backyard. And not only that, it had lights all the way around it, so I could ride during the day, during the night. I remember there were days where I would burn an entire 5-gallon tank of fuel on a TTR 90. Do you know how much riding you got to do to burn 5 gallons of gas on a TTR 90? Your boy was riding from sun up until like bedtime. As I got a bit older, I started to dabble in motocross, just a little bit. When I was about 16 years old, I went to my home track, Hangtown, with some of my friends I had recently met. These friends were very, very fast. I mean fast. One of them rode for Kawasaki and even had some arena cross titles, and the dude was the real deal. Of course, I was nervous about going with them because I didn't want to be bad. Long story short, I went out that day and it was really muddy. I ended up crashing, not a bad crash, just like kind of came up short on a little double. I fell and landed at the base of the landing on the double. I was totally fine. But then I went to put my hands down to get up, and some dude came over the double and landed on my back. I actually ended up breaking my back that day. Around this time, I started to fall in love with the military. I mean, I had always been interested in the military or law enforcement, but I was getting into my teenage years, and that desire to serve became more and more intense. When I turned 17, I talked with my parents, and they agreed to let me sign up for the Army before I turned 18. I was ecstatic. I was going to be able to serve the country I loved and hopefully do some good in the world. The Army placed me on a delayed entry program, so I had about 6 months of like normal life left before I shipped off to basic training. Man, and what an awesome 6 months that was. I went riding almost every day, just hung out with friends, just kind of did my thing for 6 months. I was just, enjoying life before I was shipping off to basic. My 6 months entry had dwindled down, and I wanted to go riding one more time. About 4 days before I was supposed to ship off to basic, I packed everything up and I went to a track up in South Lake Tahoe for one last ride. About an hour into my riding session, I made a mistake on a little double. I honestly don't know what happened, and I ended up getting absolutely yeeted over my handlebars, and I landed face first, but with my hands out. So I guess hands first, then face. This had been the worst crash I had the entire summer. Up until that point, it was just a bunch of little tip overs, nothing crazy. While I stumbled back to my feet, I heard some random guy run up to me and say, "Hey kid, you good?" I responded, "Yeah, good, I'm good, man." And he said, are you sure about that?" And he pointed down at my left arm. I looked down, and to my absolute horror, my arm was just completely broken. It wasn't like coming through, but she was a little bit snaky, Lucky for me, this random stranger happened to be a Navy corpsman, which is like a medic, on leave, so he took me over to a bench and started to rig a splint together for me. I remember this conversation so clear with him. He again asked me, "Man, you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm good. I'm just freaking out because I'm supposed to ship to basic in 4 days." He quickly responded with, "Not anymore, you're not." In that moment, my entire life had fallen apart. Everything I had been working towards for years was immediately gone. I met with my recruiters after that, and they placed me on another 6-month delay to see if I would heal up, but ultimately I was never able to go. My whole focus for the past 2 or 3 years was stripped away, and I had no purpose in life. I really wasn't sure what to do. Well, I guess like any normal 17, 18-year-old boy, I decided to divert my attention to girls. Well, specifically one girl in this case. See, I have been hanging out with this girl since I was about 14. See, her and her family ended up moving across the country when I was about 16. And for the past couple years, I had been flying out to see them and spend time with them. It was just like going back and forth. I was head over heels for this girl, and I decided, well, you know, now that I can't do the military, why not pursue her instead? On one of my trips out to see her, I decided I should move out to the state she was living in. Seems like a smart idea. It wasn't. At the time, I was working in road construction and I was a heavy equipment operator, and a really good one at that. See, my dad owned his own business growing up, and I had basically been on tractors my entire life. Pretty much the only thing I knew better than dirt bikes was probably tractor. I applied for a few jobs in the state she lived in, and I immediately got hired. The first job they wanted me to work on was actually back in California, only about 3 hours away from my house. So we created this really good plan, at least I thought. This plan would be for me to fly back to California, meet up with their crew, go on about 2 to 3 months long work trip with them over like across the whole West Coast, and when they're finished up, I would travel back with them to my new home state in the middle of the US. So I quit my excellent paying job and took this not so excellent paying job, packed everything I owned into my pickup truck and parked it in my driveway. My parents then drove me up to Red Bluff, California, where they dropped me off at a hotel with these random 4 dudes I had never met before. Our job was to fill cracks of Walmart shipping center parking lots. And yes, it was as boring as it sounds. We went from California up to Oregon, then from Oregon up to Washington, just filling cracks. This all took about 3 to 5 weeks, and then finally we had one more stop down in Los Angeles, California. We arrived in LA, and I just had to get through this 1 week and I could finally go live near this girl that I was so stoked about. Well, one day I received a phone call from said girl that basically said everything she had ever said about me and all of the feelings she had about me over the last 4 years were basically a lie, and that if I was moving out to where she was to be with her, that I shouldn't move and I should stay in California. Well, obviously I didn't want to move out to this other state, you know, if it wasn't for her, because the hate of the job, the state wasn't great. It was just like, I don't know, it just wasn't good. So I did what every reasonable young adult would do. I walked straight up to the foreman, told him, hey dude, I quit, and I was taking a cab back to the hotel to get my stuff. I basically found myself pretty much alone in Los Angeles, about 8 hours away from my hometown, with yet again no purpose and no reason to do anything. I was just kind of alone in LA, and I didn't have a job. I didn't know what to do. I spent a few days in LA just kind of wandering around the city exploring, and that was actually pretty fun. I got fed up with that and decided, well, I'm gonna go see some of my favorite people in the world. My sister and her husband lived in Colorado at the time, and I had always been really close with my sister. Her husband was also one of my best friends. Her husband's name is Ian, and he actually had just got back from a deployment and was back home, so it was a perfect time for me to go see them. The next day, I flew out to Colorado, where I spent a few weeks with them just trying to figure out what to do with my life. You see, I was raised in the church, and I became a Christian around 11 years old, so I knew, or at least I felt like all this was happening for a reason, and then I should do my best to follow God during this time, even though it was such an odd time. After some prayer and thinking, I basically decided, you know what, I'm just gonna go back home and not pursue anything. I felt like up to this point I had been pursuing something my whole life, chasing something, military, a girl. I'm just gonna go back and chill and not really do anything. Maybe I'll buy a new dirt bike and we'll start piecing life back together. The next months were honestly pretty boring. A lot of dirt bikes, and probably even more work. I was just kind of grinding dirt bikes. It was just pretty much dirt bikes work. At that time, I was living with one of my close friends when one day he comes home and says something really odd to me. He was like, hey, there's this girl I met, and I think you would really like her. See, this was odd because neither of us were really into dating, like the dating scene. Like, yeah, I had that one girl I was, chasing after, but it was really just her. Other than that, I didn't really chase girls that much, and neither did he, so it was really odd for him to say such a thing. Plus, he knew I wasn't really interested in, relationships right now. I was just kind of doing my thing. And so it was strange for him to say that, but I trusted him, and man, was I glad he did. He told me that there's a girl over at our mutual friend's house and that I should go over there for dinner and meet her. So I headed over there that night, and that is where I met Brittany. Boys, when I tell you Doc fell in love immediately, Doc fell in love immediately. She was absolutely gorgeous. I could not stop looking at her and talking to her. Come to find out, all I talked about was dirt bikes, and I guess she didn't really like that too much. Anyway, fast forward a few months, and Brittany and I are dating. Brittany was going to college down in LA, so I didn't get to see her a ton, but we would drive up or down to see each other when we could. At the time, Brittany's mom had cancer, and a few months into our dating, Brittany's mom took a serious turn for the worse, so much so that Brittany dropped out of college to come spend the last few months with her mom. Her mom continued to get sicker and sicker, and Brittany and I ended up staying with her in a small room for the last 10 days of her life. This was one of the most surreal moments I had ever experienced. To see the girl that you loved literally watch her mom die is really, really rough, and it was really hard for her and for me. I did start to see some of this big plan God had unfolding in front of me. If I had gone to the military, or if I had ended up with that other girl, I would have never met Brittany. And I've never been able to be there for her in such a difficult time. Even though there was so much pain, I could see Christ's plan, and I was full of hope and strength. I'm not saying it was easy, but there was hope. And after you go through something so difficult with someone, you have a deep, deep bond with them. Brittany and I were incredibly close to one another and knew each other on a really deep level in a short amount of time. Just a few short months later, we got engaged, and only a few months later after that, we got married. The next 2 years or so were actually pretty mellow, which was nice because it gave Brittany the chance to try to work through losing her mom, and it gave us time to just be together. Brittany and I were enjoying our lives together, just the two of us. I had started to take my walk with Jesus a lot more serious, and we were just doing life together. We went to Italy, we got our first apartment together. We're just living life, man. She was working at Starbucks and I was back paving. My two hobbies at the time were still motocross, and I loved gaming. In the winter, when I couldn't work because paving, is a seasonal thing, I would literally stay up for days. I don't mean like through the night, I mean for days, playing Destiny with my sister's husband, Ian. Ian and I had become very close, and he was my best friend at the time. I could not wait to get up in the morning after playing video games with him all night, just to play video games with him again all day and all night. Some of the most incredible gaming, if not just general memories I have, were from those times with Ian playing Destiny. One day, our peaceful and calm life would take a huge turn. I remember this day like it was yesterday. Brittany was a bridesmaid in one of her best friend's wedding, and I was helping set the wedding up. While I was setting up, I got a phone call that would change my life forever. I got a call from a close friend who said something had happened to Ian and I needed to call my sister right away. My heart sank because you know what? I knew exactly what was going on. Ian had been deployed to Afghanistan, and he had a horrendous deployment. He was in countless firefights, he hit IEDs, he was ambushed, lost friends, even was used as a ramp to roll his deceased bodies of his friends up into their vehicles so they could get back home. Because of all of this, Ian had severe PTSD. I knew exactly what was going on, and I started to panic. You see, he had issues with PTSD before, but there was something about this that felt different. I could just feel it. I called my sister, and she confirmed that Ian had left a goodbye note and that his handgun was missing. My sister and Ian lived about 2 or 3 hours away from us, and after talking back and forth with my sister, Brittany and I decided to head towards them to see if we could help find Ian, because at this point, no one really knew where he was. On the way up to them, I received another phone call from my sister. This time, I answered the phone call to the most horrific screams I had ever heard. It was my sister screaming, telling me that she was on the phone with Ian, something went wrong, and while she was on the phone, he took his own life with his gun. I will never forget the sound of her screams or the massive pit of agony and pain I was feeling in my heart. We continued to drive up to their house, where we were met with tons of police, family, and just like random people everywhere. This part of the day seemed to be in slow-mo, and I felt like I was just running through the house, pushing people, desperately trying to find my sister. I finally saw her, and she ran to me and just collapsed in my arms. Both of us were just sobbing. Just when I felt like everything was completely ruined, I opened my eyes and I saw a 3-year-old little girl hiding underneath the table. That was their little girl, Ian's little girl, and my heart broke even more. That poor little girl was so confused and scared. She just wanted Dad to come home and didn't understand why everyone else was so upset. But unfortunately for that little girl, Dad would never come home. Ian died that day. After that, Brittany and I spent about 2 weeks with my sister sorting, everything out. In the first couple days after someone dies, there's a lot that has to happen. And in this case, we needed to pick up belongings from the morgue, get his car from the parking lot it was parked in, set up the funeral, just a bunch of stuff. As the baby of the family and just kind of the youngest one there, I didn't really expect to have to do any of this, but everyone was so full of grief, it seemed like it was time for me to step up. So that's what I did. I went and I picked my best friend's stuff up from the morgue. I picked his car up from the parking lot. I remember that specific day so clear. When I opened the door of his car to take it back home, there was an open, empty pistol case sitting in the front seat. That image is forever burned in my head. I paid for the funeral so they could get that going. Even at the funeral, they decided to do an open casket, which I will never understand why people want to do that, but that's okay. My sister wanted to honor her husband and stand by his side during the funeral. Personally, I could not stand the idea of having to see my best friend's body, but she wanted to stand there with him. While she was standing with him, I could see her start to get weak and her legs started to shake. I continued to look around the room at the men and waiting for someone to get up and help her and hold her up, but no one never did. So I said, fine, you know what? I went up and I stood with her so that she had someone to lean on. For the next 45 minutes, I stared at my best friend's dead body and I could just feel my heart just breaking and breaking over and over again. I say all of this to you not to be like, oh, look how good Doc was. Look how helpful Doc was. But no, that's not why I'm saying that. But I want to paint you a picture that all of those things I was doing for those other people were creating a massive amount of resentment in my heart, not only toward the people around me, but towards God. I could not understand how God would allow me to have to endure all of that while my family got to sit by and not deal with it. Now, I have to clarify something here. I see now how it wasn't them not dealing with anything. They were also grieving. And it was extremely selfish of me to feel that way. But nonetheless, that is just where my heart was at the time. That bitterness continued to grow. And on top of all that, I felt like since I was doing so much, I never really got to process what happened. I never really got to deal with it. I never dealt with my own pain. And whenever it would surface, I would just shove it down because I needed to be strong for everyone else. This created a deeply wounded and hardened heart. And the heart that was chasing Jesus 3 months ago and just wanted nothing but to be closer to Jesus was now dark, hardened, and angry. And I wanted nothing to do with Jesus. And I mean nothing. I could hardly stand even talking about him, or even talking about church made my skin crawl. I hated it so much. Combine that with my own little PTSD things I was having from that event, and it was extremely unstable. I started to have like little mini hallucinations, or maybe they were just normal hallucinations. I swear I would see Ian walking around the store or sitting in a car next to me. I started to have extreme depression, and I don't just mean I was sad. I mean, I remember going for a walk, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the middle of a parking lot at 10 p.m. in a pool of my own tears, 4 miles away from my house. I still, to this day, I'm not really sure how I ended up there. I even started to have voices in my head. Man, they were so clear, I don't even know how to explain it, but just these really dark thoughts telling me to hurt myself or take my own life. Well, one day those voices got so loud I couldn't take it anymore. I was so full of pain and I just couldn't get away. While my wife was in the other room, I grabbed the handgun out of my nightstand, pointed at myself, and pulled the trigger. See, I had always kept a round in the chamber because I always thought, why on earth would I have a gun for self-defense if it isn't ready to defend? But for some reason that night that gun was not loaded. Instead of making the biggest mistake of my life, the gun just went click. After the gun went click, I pretty much just freaked out and threw the gun back in the drawer and acted like it never happened. 40 years, my heart continued to harden and I continued to close up. My friendships were hurting because of it. My marriage was suffering because of it. I had basically turned my back on my wife and was the least loving, caring, or kind human to her throughout that entire process. Fortunately for me, my wife was full of Jesus at the time and continued to cling to him, and she pushed through my failures as a husband and loved me unconditionally like I had never seen before. All that while always encouraging me to read my Bible or go to church with her, which I hated at the time. On the outside, life was actually looking really good. We had just bought our first house at 20 years old. I was making around 6 figures a year. We just had my son. Everything was looking awesome. But to be honest, on the inside, I was rotting away. I felt nothing, and I felt abandoned by God and completely broken. Around that time, Brittany and I had been talking about moving out of California. We had discussed moving to Texas and maybe me pursuing Border Patrol. That ended up being something we decided against, but we still had this desire to move. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we had just had my son and recently purchased our first home. Plus, all of our friends and family were in California. I mean, we were both born and raised in the area, so everything we knew was there. We both really struggled with this decision of should we move or should we not. We struggled so much so that one day my wife drugged me to church and I decided to pray and ask God for clarity. Now, keep in mind, up to this point, I hadn't really prayed in years. I mean, since Ian died. I had done nothing but shove God away, and I was pretty sure that if there even was a God, that he had forgotten about me. After all, I had been asking him to just go away and leave me alone. Anyway, my wife drags me to church one day, and I am uncomfortably sitting there surrounded by all these seemingly happy people while I'm just wallowing in my own frustration and anger. I decided, you know what, fine. I'll pray, not like he's gonna answer anything, but I'll give it a shot. So I bow my head and I start to pray, not paying attention to the pastor at all, by the way. To this day, I have no idea what that sermon was about. I remember praying something along the lines of, okay, God, my wife and I are trying to make a decision to move, but I don't know what to do. So if you're there, could you please give me some sort of sign on what to do? I said amen with the full expectation that nothing would come of that prayer. But to my surprise, the first thing, and I mean the absolute first words out of the pastor's mouth were, sometimes you need to follow God, even if that means moving your family across the country. I was absolutely shook, completely caught off guard, and basically speechless. I had shoved God away for years, told him I hated him and I wanted nothing to do with him, and the one time I asked him for guidance, he showed up. I was so full of emotion, but I went from hating God to a deep understanding that I was loved and he did not leave me alone, and that he had been there the whole time regardless of how I treated him through my own pain. Also, I realized, dude, we gotta move. There is no way I'm going to hear that and then now be disobedient. My wife and I ended up talking after that sermon and decided, man, yeah, we do gotta move. But where? We knew we were supposed to move, but had no idea where to. Over the next couple months, we started to do research on all of the states in the United States, and we began to narrow things down just a little bit. We basically started Googling things about each state, schools, laws. We were Googling scenery, guys. We knew nothing about probably 30 of the states. We were Googling, pictures of the mountains, the fields there, the cities. We ended up narrowing things down to 3 states: Pennsylvania, Iowa, and Michigan. We decided Pennsylvania is cold, but it ain't Michigan cold, so we crossed Michigan off. So now it was between Pennsylvania and Iowa. I was reading about Iowa and I read an article and the headline was, Iowa has more pigs than people. In that moment, I was like, well, guess we're moving to Pennsylvania. The next few months were like absolute chaos. We had to flip our house so that we could sell it for a decent profit to get enough money to move across the country. I ended up having to live in an Airbnb for like 3 months while my wife and son lived with my parents about an hour away from me. We didn't have a ton of money to go out to PA and spend time looking around for our, favorite area. So I basically just blanket applied every job I qualified for across the entire state. And wherever I got a job was where we were gonna live. I started talking with an awesome company and I ultimately ended up getting that job. I also ended up buying a house off my cell phone, by the way. Luckily, I did have to fly out for an in-person interview to secure the job, and I was able to look at the house, so it wasn't totally foreign to me, but my wife had never seen the house at all. It was official. My California house sold, I had a job in Pennsylvania, and I even now had a house in escrow in Pennsylvania. We couldn't afford to move all of our stuff across the country, so I rented a 12x12 trailer that we towed behind my wife's little SUV, and basically, if it didn't fit in the trailer, we either gave it away, sold it, or threw it away. We ended up taking like 0 furniture. Really, I think it was just like beds, clothes, kitchen stuff, and sentimental things like pictures or, it was bare minimum. My dad and I ended up driving from California to Pennsylvania with the trailer about a week ahead of my wife and son just to make sure everything was ready to go before they got there. My wife and son flew out about a week later in the middle of a night to a state they had never been before. Man, looking back, I realized how wild that was. We moved to a city I had only been to for like 45 minutes, into a house I spent like 5 minutes in, and my wife had only seen pictures of, to a state neither of us had really ever been to. I realize now how absolutely insane that sounds, and to be honest, it really was. But we both wanted to be obedient to Christ, and if that meant going across the US to a random place, we were going to do it. The next few months were pretty mellow, just getting used to our new home and job. One day, I needed to work late. My office was about 45 minutes away from me, and so I left around 7 p.m. Now, I hadn't reached my 3-month mark with the company yet, so I didn't have my company vehicle. I was still commuting my wife's car, our only car, to and from work. Now, this was in the middle or kind of end of December, so it was cold and really foggy. I was headed home and approaching an intersection. Now, this particular intersection had some bushes and stuff on the side of the road, so it made it really difficult to see cross traffic. Like I said, it was also really foggy. Oh, and also keep in mind, I'd only driven this road maybe 3 or 4 times because I just moved there and I had been exploring different routes on my way to and from work. Anyway, as I approached the intersection, I remember thinking, I feel like there should be a stop sign here, but I looked and clearly there wasn't one, and so I continued through the intersection. As I entered the intersection, I looked to my right only to see 2 headlights, and the next thing I knew, I was T-boned at about 50 miles an hour, hurtling my car like 60, 70 feet down the road into the ditch. My wife's car, which was pretty much brand new, was completely totaled. It basically V'd, like when the guy hit me on the side, it like folded the car in half. Luckily, there weren't any serious injuries on my end or the people that hit me. Once the fire department got there, they informed me that about 10 minutes before I crossed that intersection, there was actually a previous car accident, and that car accident took out my stop sign, which is why I couldn't see it. And for whatever reason, they just left the intersection open. There was no stop sign ahead sign, there was no flares, there was no emergency people or vehicles slowing traffic, there was nothing. Actually, while I was there talking to the fire department, the people who were supposed to replace the sign showed up and put it in while my car was being towed. I got a ride back home with the police officer, and the only thing I could think the entire time was, what now? We had just left all of our friends, all of our family, everything we knew, and my one and only car was now total. We had no way to get around. I was completely stressed out of my mind. This is the beginning of many lessons to come where God would test me to trust him in like terrible situations so that he could come through and only he could be glorified. That situation actually ended up being a major blessing in disguise. See, that car we had was a two-wheel drive, and the insurance ended up covering everything, and we were able to get another vehicle that was all-wheel drive. That winter ended up being pretty bad, so that all-wheel drive came in clutch. This is just a good example of how God's plan is better than ours. Man, to be honest, the next few years were pretty mellow. I just worked a lot, got settled into our new state, our new house. At one point, I even got some investors together and we flipped a house. That was actually insane. I do not suggest working 50 to 60 hours a week and then flipping a house after work and on the weekends. And I don't mean like a little flip. This thing was absolutely insane, like 100% complete remodel. I did end up learning a lot of skills in that process, but man, that was tough. That sucked. Before I go into this next part, I need to give you a little bit of backstory. So for years, like 5, 7, 8 years, I had these really weird symptoms where wherever I would get stressed, I would get these like weird flu-like symptoms. You know, achy, shivers, dizzy, headache, pressure in my head. I would feel like I was gonna get a fever, but I never actually would, my temperature would never spike, but I would always have those like flu symptoms. There was even this one time I lost my vision, and I'm not exaggerating, I could not see when I woke up. We went to the ER, my vision came back, they just said, you know what, man, you're too stressed out. There was even a time I couldn't move my neck. Like, I don't know how to explain it, but like I could not look left or right. Went to the ER again, they said, man, you just gotta be stressed. My wife and I would always just call it stress sick because there was really no other explanation. I just did my best to reduce my stress or sleep, and I would usually like go away. Anyway, in May of 2021, I was getting up in the morning to go downstairs to get my work phone when I slipped at the top of my stairs and I took a tumble all the way down. When I fell, I snapped my head back really hard and it gave myself a pretty solid concussion. I got extremely dizzy, my vision got blurry, and I had a ton of pressure in my head. It was just all bad. I was no stranger to concussions. I mean, I raced dirt bikes my whole life, so of course I was used to them. Up to that point, I had received about 6 concussions in the past, so I knew what I needed to do. I needed to just go rest for a couple days and ease back into life. After a few days, I ended up going back to work. Man, was that a mistake. That I was still so dizzy and tired and pressure, and it just, none of it would go away. This turned out to be a really bad, if not the worst concussion I have ever experienced. So much so, I thought, man, I should go get checked out. So I went to the ER just to be sure, and I went that night. They diagnosed me with a severe concussion and told me to go home and rest. Well, again, after about another week of rest, when, typically you're starting to feel better, my symptoms really didn't start to improve at all. I then went to see my family doctor and was like, bro, what is going on with my head? He ran some more tests and checked me out a little bit more. He ultimately ended up diagnosing me with something called permanent post-concussive syndrome. And that was caused by having basically too many concussions, and that my most recent one just kind of did me in and it wouldn't heal. Basically, this means I just have concussion symptoms like 24/7, and I've had them ever since. He sent me to a specialist, even a form of cognitive regeneration physical therapy for like 3 months. All of these things came back with zero improvement. Even the physical therapy actually made things even worse. All the doctors collectively decided stress or really any spike of emotion or quick movements in my head would give me spikes in my condition. This meant if I had any stress, anger, overstimulation, anything, I would get dizzy, have a ton of pressure, blurry vision, and I wouldn't be able to focus like at all. The doctors pretty much medically retired me that day, and they also, medically like took my license away, so I can't drive anymore either. So here I am, 26, 27 years old, not able to work, not able to drive. We were a single family income at the time because we had just had my daughter, so my wife was at home with the kids. I had just lost everything really, all of our income, my job, my ability to be independent and drive and be on my own. Honestly, I felt like I had lost everything it meant to be a man. I was the provider, the protector. I was the one who took care of everyone, and now I felt completely useless and dependent on those around me. My faith had been tested, and my trust in God had been tested in the past. Would I travel across the country out of obedience to God? Would I trust in Him without a vehicle? Now it seemed He was pushing me even farther. Would I trust Him with my house, my car, my wife, my children? I knew that God had a purpose in this, and I knew it wasn't for nothing. But man, was it hard. I began to pray and read and seek God's will of my life. Now that I was stripped of everything I knew that was normal, I wanted to know, all right, God, what do you have for me? Like, I'm not just gonna sit around and do nothing. I know He has something for me. I just didn't know what it was. I prayed and fasted for about a month. And one night I was at a Bible study and someone was praying for me. We were talking about it, what to do. And someone was praying and they said, man, I just feel like God is asking you to think of what do you want to do? What do you want to do and pursue that? To be honest, I was pretty skeptical of that statement. Sometimes, the Bible can be pretty clear that God's plan for you is often different than what you think it is. And, what you might want to do. God has a different plan. But I also know that God can use our passions and stuff that we enjoy to proclaim His name. So I decided, you know what, maybe I will pray about that. I'll pursue that. And I started to think of like, man, if I could do anything, what would I want to do? I've always loved dirt bikes and video games, so I kept thinking about possibilities in those areas. I thought, a dirt bike riding camp, but that didn't make any sense because, I can't ride because if I hit my head, I'm gonna die, I was just trying to think of what could I do. Nothing was really standing out to me and nothing felt right. However, when I was praying, there was one thing that continued to come up, and that was to create content again. But to be honest, I didn't really want to. I had tried to make content in the past, like way back when Fortnite dropped, and it was miserable. I didn't grow. My wife hated it. I neglected my kids, and it was just like a pointless waste of time playing a video game, and it always just felt like a fight. Like it was a struggle. I remember praying one night to God and just being like, God, the last time I did this, it was miserable. Like, why are you telling me to do this again? I really don't want to. And I remember it as clear as day. I heard Him say, you failed last time because I wasn't at the center. And in that moment, I was like, oh my, I need to start making content again. And I need to do it with the goal to share Jesus through video games. Well, like what an untapped area. Look, how cool would that be? So in September of 2021, I uploaded my first YouTube video. The next year and a half has been me dedicated to making content, playing video games, connecting with people, and sharing the love and hope that only can be found in Jesus. Now, I'm not saying we're the most successful channel, but in about a year, we've gone from 0 to millions of views and 6,000 subs, and I believe it is all because of Christ. This was His plan. He needed me to go through all of that stuff that I went through my whole life so that I could get to this stinking channel, so that I could share about how God has pulled me through the most horrendous things you could think of, and that I'm still here. I'm still good. He still loves us. He still loves you. That's what this was all about. The last year and a half hasn't been easy by any means. We have had literally no steady income since I lost my job way back in 2021. And we have only survived by the grace of God. He has provided the money we need to keep our home, our car, food on the table, and basically everything we need in nothing short of miraculous ways. We have seen envelopes of money on our doorstep. We've seen checks from the government that make 0 cents. The government don't like to give you money, but we just got big checks from the government to help us out. Family and friends have helped us incredibly. We've had, random donations given to our church anonymously to give to us. I mean, the ways God has provided for us have been insane. Now the YouTube channel is starting to provide. I believe God stripped everything away from me so that I could do His work. and he has continued to provide for us to whatever we need to continue to do his work. A good example, like this is a small example, but a good one. At one point, my microphone broke. The microphone I used to stream and make videos, it broke, and I was like, oh no, what am I gonna do? That day, I got a call from my sister, was like, hey, I bought you a microphone, just because, I love you. Yeah, I don't know, just stuff like that. I believe all the loss, all the pain my wife and I went through was just to build our trust in God, so that we would be willing to step out and do his work, so that we could help others and share Christ with others and let them know that, God is there, he loves you, and there's a plan for your life. Even when it's, horrible and it seems like there is no hope, there is hope in Jesus. I'm here to tell you that no matter how much hurt you have, Jesus is there and you are loved, and there's a purpose for your life. I know I've said that like 3 times, but I gotta say it again. Even when all is lost and there's no hope, Jesus is there waiting for you. That doesn't mean that things will be easy, but it does mean he is always there. There is a peace that can only be found in Christ, and if you would like to have a conversation about that peace or anything else I talked about in this video, you're welcome to DM me on Twitter, Instagram, or Discord. All of those links are down in the description. And also, if you're just going through something and you need a friend, whether you want to talk about Jesus or not, if you just want a friend, I would love to be that friend for you, and you're welcome to DM me as well. I love you guys, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.